Okay, so for this video, we're going to be learning about direct variation and indirect variation. So first we're going to start off by explaining, what is direct variation, what is indirect variation. So when you have an equation that looks like this, y equals a, which is called a constant of variation, it's just some number that's not zero, times x. When we have an equation that looks like this, then we call this direct variation. So I'll put direct. And when we have an equation that looks like this, y is equal to a divided by x, then this kind of equation is called an inverse variation. I'm sorry, I need to make a small correction in my video. I said indirect variation. I meant to say inverse variation. Sorry about that. So this is the inverse. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. So in your review, you have at the top of one of the pages 4 different problems, and it's asking you to identify if the variation is direct, if it's inverse, or if there is none. So let's go ahead and look at letter A. So for letter A, we have x plus y is equal to 3. Okay, now this kind of equation, when you write it in y equals form, we have y equals to 3 minus x. So when you write it like this, it does not look like this guy, and it does not look like this guy. So this kind of variation is neither. So that's the answer for that one. It's neither. Now, let's look at letter choice B. Let me just put a line here so we can differentiate this. Okay, so for B, we have y minus 5x is equivalent to 0. Okay, so what do we do now? We're going to write the equation in y equals form. So I'm going to put y is equal to, that's a y, and I'm going to put plus 5x because I'm moving it to the other side of the equation. So we get y is equal to 5x because 5x plus 0 is 5x. So notice that this guy, y equals 5x, looks like the one up here. It's a direct variation. So the constant of variation in this question, in this example, is 5. So this is your constant of variation, and it's a direct variation. So I'm going to put direct. Direct. Okay. Let me put a line here to divide our work. Okay. Now let's look at letter C. So I'm going to write it over here. For letter C, we have x times y is equal to 4. So when we solve the equation for y, we divide this by x. So we get y is equal to 4 divided by x. Aha, so what does this guy look like? He looks like the inverse, where 4 is your constant of variation. So I'm going to put an A right there with an arrow. So this guy is going to be an inverse variation. Inverse. Okay. Now, when we think about an inverse variation, intuitively, this is what it means. When x values get larger and larger and larger and larger and larger, the entire fraction gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So the idea is that as x gets really, really, really large, y gets really, 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 really small. And so that's why it's called an inverse variation. If we go back to the direct variation, when x gets really, 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 really large, you multiply that by a, so you get y becoming really, really, really large if a is a positive number. So if a is like, let's say it's 20, then when you let x equal to 100, you get 100 times 20 for y. And then let's say you let x equal 500, then you get 500 times 20, which is equal to y, and so that's larger than 100 times 20. Anyway, getting back to this. So this guy is inverse variation. Now let's look at letter D. And what does letter D have? It has x is equal to 3 divided, well, that's a terrible 3. 3, still bad. Okay, 3 divided by y. Remember that we want to write this in y equals form. So what we have to do is multiply this side by y to cancel out the y's here, and we multiply this side by y. So what do we get? We have y times x is equal to 3. And then the next thing that we do is divide by x, and we divide by x. So we finally get y is equal to 3 divided by x. So now this guy, what does he look like? He is an inverse. So this is inverse variation. And the constant of variation for this guy is 3. Why? Because the 3 is the guy that corresponds to letter A. Okay, so that wraps up our small introduction to direct and inverse variation. See you next time.